intentionally left the road open to Concord. However, the British then proceeded to march straight towards the militia, no doubt expecting a fight, but at the last minute, a British officer ordered both his own men and the militia to disperse. What happened next is unclear, but what we do know is that there was a firefight in which 8 militiamen were killed, and greater carnage was only stopped when the lieutenant colonel in charge of the British forces, Francis Smith, arrived to restore order. After this incident, which was the first engagement of the coming war, the British forces moved on to the town of Concord, which was their objective, and once there searched the town, but were eventually driven back towards Boston itself by the militia. The colonialists had won strategic victories at the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and there was no going back, as either British rule would continue, or the 13 colonies would gain their independence. A month after the battles, in the Second Continental Congress, which George Washington attended, the Continental Army was officially created, which was comprised of the militia units that had confronted the British at the battles around Boston. Washington was then appointed Commanding General of the Continental Army in July 1775, and first inspected his new force at Cambridge, Massachusetts, but was disappointed to find his new army was in a sorry state, being ill-disciplined and badly equipped. The British in turn labelled the colonials as traitors, which effectively meant that anyone supporting or fighting for the rebel cause would be subject to the harshest of punishments if captured. In the summer of 1775, the British attempted to break out of Boston in the Battle of Bunker Hill, and despite claiming victory, sustained such losses that further advances were impossible, and in March of the following year were forced to evacuate the city due to the Continental Army bringing cannons in range of the harbor. Washington then prepared for an attack on the Loyalist city of New York, but the British under General William Howe returned and occupied Long Island in September of 1776. July 1776 is also arguably one of the most important months in the history of the United States, as on the 4th of July, the 13 colonies' Declaration of Independence was ratified. The purpose of this document was to announce and explain that the 13 colonies were declaring their independence from Great Britain, which made it perfectly clear that the coming war was not just simply an uprising, but was instead a full-scale insurrection or revolution aimed at gaining independence from Great Britain. In the meantime, in New York, General Howe had landed with a force of some 40,000 men, all of whom were professional soldiers, whereas Washington's force, although comparable in numbers, were not nearly as highly trained or disciplined, as many of them were simply armed citizens or militia. Washington was also operating under false intelligence, which led him to believe that the British force was much smaller than his own, and he decided to stand and fight them. Over the coming days and series of engagements, the British were able to force the colonials to withdraw across the Hudson River, and Howe was then welcomed into New York as a liberator by its loyalist population. This period in the winter of 1776 was arguably the darkest period for the colonials during the Revolutionary War, as Washington's Continental Army now numbered in the region of only a few thousand men who were poorly equipped, trained, and fed. The Continental Army was then granted a reprieve, as Howe, who arguably should have pressed home his advantage as soon as possible, decided to overwinter in New York and wait for spring. Around a quarter of his army at this time consisted of German-born mercenaries known as Hessians, a number of whom, during the winter of 1776, were posted at the north bank of the River Delaware at Trenton, at the southwestern edge of British-held territory. On Christmas Eve 1776, Washington devised a plan to cross the Delaware and attack the Hessians stationed at Trenton. He then led the attack in person on the morning of Boxing Day, the 26th of December, and conducted a successful surprise attack on the Hessians, in which their commanding officer was killed Hundreds were captured, and large amounts of supplies were seized. This attack and the crossing of the Delaware was a minor victory, but it was a crucial morale booster for the Continental Army, and provided them with a renewed sense of purpose, as well as the previously mentioned supplies. The next summer, the British launched a major invasion of the 13 colonies from their main base in Quebec, which was led by General John Burgoyne. However, General Howe, based in New York, decided to push south himself into Philadelphia, rather than wait for Burgoyne's army to join him. Washington then moved north to confront Howe, and the two armies met at the Battle of Brandywine on the 11th of September, 1777, when the British defeated the Continental Army and occupied Philadelphia. But this victory itself was marred as a few weeks later to the north, Burgoyne's army of around 7,000 men was defeated, and on the 17th of October, he was forced to surrender at the Battle of Saratoga. General Howe then sent a letter of resignation home to London, which was duly accepted in October of 1777, in which he complained he had been inadequately supported during his Philadelphia campaign, and he was then replaced as Commander-in-Chief of British forces by Sir Henry Clinton. The next year saw further fighting around Pennsylvania and New Jersey, with the two sides fighting an inconclusive battle at Monmouth on the 28th of June, 1778. In the spring of 1778 came one of the crucial turning points in the war, when the Continental Congress agreed an alliance with Louis XVI of France. The French king was eager to humiliate the British and help the Americans, as his country had been defeated in the 7 Years' War, and in turn resulted in the loss of the vast majority of France's North American territories. But, in order to support the Americans, Louis had to stretch the near-bankrupt French economy to breaking point, which would eventually play a significant role in igniting the French Revolution.
Hey Dad, this for you.
Later that year, Sir Henry Clinton sought to go on the offensive by launching an invasion of the southern colonial state of Georgia from New York, with the goal of recapturing the southern colonies and their sizable loyalist population, culminating in the capture of Savannah in Georgia. Indeed, although the American Revolutionary War pitted the British against those colonialists who sought independence, in many respects, it was also a civil war, as often friends and family fought against each other on either side. In January of 1780, Sir Henry Clinton led a 17,000-strong army into South Carolina and assaulted the city of Charleston, and then returned to New York, splitting his forces and leaving the remainder under the command of Lord Charles Cornwallis. This meant that the British now effectively controlled the southern colonies, as well as New York, which was yet another low point for Washington and Congress. Summer of 1780, fresh supplies, arms, and troops arrived from France under the command of the Marquis de Lafayette, which would prove to be crucial. After overwintering in the December of 1780 in New York State, Washington was convinced by his French allies to attack Lord Cornwallis in the south, instead of concentrating their efforts against Sir Henry Clinton in the north. He then outmaneuvered Clinton with a feint and headed south, where in the late summer of 1781, the French Navy defeated the Royal Navy at the Battle of Chesapeake, which cut off Lord Cornwallis's supply lines from the main British base in New York, and he was soon forced to surrender at the Battle of Yorktown in October of 1781. The British then withdrew from Savannah in 1782, and a peace treaty was then finally signed on the 3rd of September, 1783, in Paris, ending the war, resulting shortly afterwards in 1783, the last British troops within the 13 colonies were evacuated from New York. In many ways, the British had always been fighting an uphill battle in their attempt to retain the 13 colonies. As with the French before them in the French and Indian War, they were massively outnumbered by the colonial population, and their supply lines stretched thousands of miles across the Atlantic. As his job was now done, Washington resigned as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army in in December of 1783 and returned to Mount Vernon the following year, where he once again oversaw his estates. 4 years later, Washington was elected to oversee the Constitutional Convention starting on the 25th of May 1787, resulting in the American Constitution then being formally signed on the 17th of September 1787. Although he never saw himself as a politician and was reluctant to formally involve himself in politics, Washington was seen as a natural leader by those surrounding him, as he after all was the hero of the war against the British and had relatively neutral political views.
I won't do no
The new American Constitution stipulated the requirement for the creation of the positions of President and Vice President. Washington had remained largely impartial in the various disputes during the first Constitutional Convention. He was seen as an ideal candidate to be the first president of the United States.
I won't do that white girl again,
The first American presidential election then went ahead in early 1789, with Washington winning a majority in every state, and John Adams was elected vice president under him.
On me, because it's violations of rights.
Washington then formed the first cabinet and appointed Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as the Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox as Secretary of War, and Edmund Randolph as Attorney General.
And I open up a case
He intelligently assigned his subordinates equally to positions within his cabinet, so that neither of the two political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, had a majority over the other.
Lifelong, past
It was a conflict between these two parties, or rather the disagreements between them, which had been the reason for Washington's ascent to the presidency, as he commanded universal respect of all those around him, and was also extremely reserved, cautious, and careful during his tenure as president, seeking to take as few risks as possible to preserve the fragile Union. He also often refused to take sides, seeking to compromise as much as possible, and there is a consensus that without him acting as a neutral figurehead during the transitional period, that the Union may have fractured or split between the rival parties.
I'm in love with your daddy. You're right about the gas.
Division between Washington's subordinates themselves, as the Republican Jefferson disagreed with the Federalist Hamilton about the creation of a new national bank.
Granddaddy, I love you.
Hamilton wanted to establish a national bank which would take control of state debt and loans, whilst Jefferson was strongly opposed to the measure and wanted the states of which the new nation was comprised to retain fiscal independence. However, Jefferson agreed to the bank's creation on condition that the nation's capital was moved to Georgetown in 1790, which was, in turn, renamed in George Washington's honor in 1791, and is today known as Washington, D.C. There were also growing concerns amongst Republicans that the federalization of their new nation would mean the centralizing of power, and many, such as Jefferson, feared this would trample on the freedoms of various states as well as individuals. This led in December of 1791 to the First Amendment being ratified, which, along with the Bill of Rights, was designed to protect freedom of religion, press, and speech, to name but a few, and address the concerns of the anti-federalists, such as Jefferson, who feared that the centralization of power would lead one day to the kind of tyranny the 13 colonies had fought so hard to escape. The First Amendment and Bill of Rights are still regarded by many as being amongst the most important documents in the history of the English-speaking world, as they enshrine civil liberties into the American Constitution and are, along with the Magna Carta and English common law, the foundations of American democracy. Over the coming years, Washington declared America's neutrality when Europe was engulfed in the French Revolutionary Wars, and also spent the next few years overseeing America's victory in the Northwest Indian War against Native American tribes who were allied with the British. He was then re-elected for a second term in February of 1793, but during his second term, the division between the two parties in his cabinet increased as they bickered over various issues, leading to Washington himself being heavily criticized in the Federalist and Republican press, which hurt him deeply. He also signed various acts relating to slavery, allowing slave owners to cross state lines to capture fugitive slaves, but also signed the Slave Trade Act of 1794, which limited the involvement of the United States in the continuing Atlantic slave routes. The president then, in 1794, signed another act to create the United States Navy, and at the end of 1797, made the decision to retire and return to his estates at Vernon, Virginia. He was not blessed with much time to enjoy his retirement, however, and after riding in the snow in December of 1799, developed a violent inflammation of the throat, along with chest congestion. Over the coming days, Washington became progressively more and more ill, and finally died peacefully, with his wife Martha at his bedside, on the 14th of December, 1799, aged 67. The first president of the United States was then buried at Mount Vernon, and after his death, a new vault was constructed which still houses the body of both George Washington and his wife to this very day. George Washington is today seen as one of, if not the most important figure in American history. The leadership he showed during the American Revolutionary War was one of the crucial factors in the eventual victory, and without his leadership, it is difficult to see how American independence would have transpired. In terms of his military career, despite early setbacks and defeats in the early to middle stages of the War of Independence, George Washington eventually proved himself to be an extremely capable commander, who earned the respect of those under him, and eventually formed in the Continental Army a fighting force which was comparable, if not equal, to that of the British. He is sometimes criticised for owning slaves and being an active participant in the slave trade, but it is important to remember that Washington was born into an age where slavery was the accepted norm for the ruling classes, and that he knew no different or better. George Washington is seen by many people today, as he was by his contemporaries, as the perfect candidate to lead the United States in the years of its birth, as his cool, calm, cautious leadership brought stability to the early republic, and also brought the vying political parties together under his authority. During his presidency and afterwards, George Washington became an icon or a symbol which the people of the United States could rally round and believe in, which is just as true today as it was over 200 years ago. It is the 4th of July, 1776. The Second Continental Congress meets at the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia to ratify the 13 colonies' Declaration of Independence from Great Britain by signing one of the most important documents in history of the Western world, composed by one of the founding fathers of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, in words which will echo through history. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. April 1743 in Shadwell, Virginia, close to present-day Charlottesville. His mother, Jane Randolph Jefferson, was born in Shanksville Walk, Shadwell, London, into a wealthy family who were also prominent figures in the United States, owning and operating a plantation in the state of Virginia, whilst Thomas's father was Peter Jefferson, who was a leading surveyor and cartographer, and was born in present-day Chesterfield County, also in Virginia. Jefferson's family moved to the Tuckahoe Plantation near Richmond when he was very young, where his formative years in education were spent in private tuition, but upon moving back to Shadwell, Virginia in 1752, he was taught at a Presbyterian school, where he began learning Latin, Greek, and French from the age of 9. says later ideas and observations were shaped over a period of time through his endless
That's
pursuit of
Ann
knowledge,
too, Pops.
and from an early age, Jefferson's